Hey everyone, Raptor Chatter here, and we're going to be looking at some of the biggest paleontological finds from December 2023. There is a good amount to get through, so let's get started. We're going to start with the Halgaido Formation, which, look at it, me for scale. It's a pretty large unit of rock that is made up of primarily red beds, meaning that whatever stream was depositing all of this sand would have still had a lot of that sand and mud have access to oxygen so it could oxidize and turn red. So that's the kind of environment we're dealing with when we're thinking about this in the paleo context. It would have been a big floodplain or delta environment leading into the ocean. Halgaidosaurus gregarius is a new species of Araeoscelidian that comes from the Carboniferous part of the Halgaido Formation, and it adds to the diversity that we understand in the Araeoscelidians, which is this group of very early reptiles that we mostly find in North America. Now, this one was actually found in Bears Ears National Monument, so very much where you would expect it to be. It's from Utah. We find these things in North America. This one is no different. Still, it helps to show that they were fairly diverse and fairly widespread throughout parts of the Carboniferous and then later into the Permian as the reptiles, as well as their synapsid relatives, started to really diversify and become more like the kind of life that we recognize on land today. We're also very fortunate that there's a lot of them. In the site where it was found, Halgaidosaurus makes up 55% of all of the vertebrate fossils in the locality. So that means there's a lot of them and we can understand a lot of the different kind of traits that they would have had, such as a tooth count between some of those found in other Araeoscelidians such as Brachiosaurus and Araeoscelidian. This is just a preliminary description, but I'm sure as more research is done on this organism, as well as other early Araeoscelidians, we'll be able to get a better understanding of how reptiles actually came to be slightly different from all of the other groups that were around them, including things like the synapsids. Small reptiles like the Araeoscelidians would eventually evolve into things that were the largest animals to ever walk on land, the sauropods. And at least very early on in paleontology, there was this general trend that, oh hey, all of the plants that were around back when the dinosaurs were walking the earth would have been much harder to digest, and that really means that essentially, oh, they must have been cold-blooded because they couldn't have gotten enough energy for being warm-blooded because those plants would be so hard to digest. This paper, though, tested that by looking at relatives of groups that actually got their start, and we have the earliest fossils of in the Jurassic, when sauropods were really starting to balloon to massive sizes. What they found is that some of these later diverging groups of these different plants actually would have been fairly easily digested, at least compared to the other plants around. This means that these plants potentially would have enabled the sauropods to both get super large and also still be pretty warm-blooded. And it is kind of more of a spectrum between warm-blooded and cold-bloodedness, but they were probably at least leaning a little bit more on the warm-blooded side, and these plants would have let them do that. There was also a study that looked at fossils of angiosperm plants, which also did show up in the Mesozoic. Angiosperms are just fruit and flower-bearing plants. They essentially have the flower in order to grow a fruit, and that helps to protect the seeds. It's slightly more complicated than what you see in things like cone-bearing plants, the gymnosperms. For example, you have pine cones, which are gymnosperm organs for delivering seeds and protecting seeds. They're slightly different from a fruit, though. By looking at the fossils of the angiosperms, though, this team of researchers was able to say, hey, they were actually the most morphologically diverse very early in their evolution. Later on, though, many of those different kinds of plants actually converged on similar morphotypes in order to be successful. So there's less diversity now, potentially, than there actually was back when they first got their start. As for the origins of the sauropods, you have to go back a little bit earlier to the Triassic. And there was a paper looking at one of the very important climatic events that happened in the Triassic, the Carnian pluvial episode, where it potentially just rained for around 2 million years straight, at least across most of the world. And this paper actually suggests it wasn't just 2 million years straight, and that's based on the presence of kaolinite in different sediments around the world. Kaolinite is a clay mineral that forms from large amounts of erosion that are happening in the mountains. What they were able to do is track down certain increases in kaolinite and other minerals to help suggest that there were 4 separate, highly erosive events, which again probably means lots of rain during those different times. This does line up with the Carnian pluvial event, so it does seem like it was one event with 4 sub-events in it, and that's really what led to the changes that we see in the environments during the late Triassic, including potentially the rise of the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs really took off, though, at the very end of the Triassic, as opposed to during the Carnian pluvial episode, which was at the beginning of the late Triassic, which just kind of set the stage for them to take advantage of the environment later. The end of the Triassic is punctuated by a mass extinction, and this paper actually tried to just see if we could understand how these things might have actually worked differently on land versus in the marine realm, because there's a lot better marine record for fossils, and so we can understand that extinction a little bit better. What they did is they used something that's been used in invertebrate paleontology for a long time, where there's these little blocks, and we're able to understand where different organisms would have actually lived and how they may have behaved based on where they've landed in those different kind of ecospace blocks. And these authors essentially just took that kind of framework and applied it to land-based environments during the late Triassic. And I think this is really interesting and potentially very exciting for a number of different reasons, but at least this is the start of being able to understand how we can quantify different extinction events, and in this case they actually found that one of the main drivers of the differences we see on land and in the oceans could have been potentially just there was less redundancy in terrestrial environments. So for example, if you had a large herbivore that was living on land and it went extinct, that was probably the only or maybe one of two large herbivores on land at that location, meaning essentially you lost up to 50 to 100% of animals that were occupying that niche. Meanwhile, if you're looking at this similar kind of ecospace that exists in marine realms, there's a lot more redundancy. If you lose one species, there's still 3 or 4 that can help to fill in that kind of ecospace. So essentially, one single disturbance that takes out a species doesn't disrupt the entire ecosystem in the same way. At least in the Triassic, that's what occurred. The end Triassic extinction seems to have largely been caused by the CAMP, or Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, which was a large area of volcanism that released tons of gases as Pangaea actually started to break up. In fact, a lot of mass extinctions seem to have been caused by large igneous provinces, or lips. And what they were able to actually find in this study was not all of them actually do cause mass extinctions. There's a lot of differences in how lips actually affect the environment. And potentially that we really should study all of these, because it's going to be really important for us to understand the effects that different large igneous provinces had on their environments, so we can actually prepare for the consequences of climate change, specifically human-caused climate change. Because a lot of those gases are really similar, and humans are releasing them at an even faster rate than just kilometers of lava can. But even with the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province opening up, there is still a lot of migration between different continents. And a single tooth coming from Denmark helps us suggest that one group of sauropods, the Turiasaurs, actually got their start not just in Europe, but in the early Jurassic, just as the camp was really starting to break apart parts of Pangaea. Because the Turiasaurs were able to eventually make it to North America and Africa, it really helps us suggest that during the early Jurassic, there was still only a limited amount of breakup of Pangaea, and some migration between different continents could still occur. But after the early Jurassic, some of those sauropods, like I mentioned before, got massive, and that includes things like Brachiosaurus. Researchers looking at the ribs of Brachiosaurus were able to recognize totally unique structures linked to pneumatization, which is essentially there's air sacs that would be going into the ribs to help support the weight of the organism. We see this in some other sauropods, but not in the ribs. It's mostly in the vertebra, and Brachiosaurus probably has some of this too. However, in this case, it's really, really unique because we, again, don't see it in any of these other dinosaur groups, and especially sauropod groups, because a lot of them were getting to similar sizes, but this is the only time we found pneumatization in the ribs. Speaking of giant sauropods, Bustingorrytitan Shiva is a new massive titanosaur coming from the Winkle Formation. Compared to many titanosaurs, it's actually pretty complete, and that's really unique because, again, these animals are massive, and it takes a lot of sediment to actually bury them completely. So most of the time we just end up with a few isolated fragments of the heavier bones that are more likely to stay together. In this case, though, we have basically all of the limbs as well as a lot of the vertebra and some of the ribs. There's still no skull material, which is unfortunate, but that's often expected in large sauropod finds. Still, it lived in the Winkle Formation, which is the same formation that we find Argentinosaurus in, and that means potentially there were two massive, many tonned animals living alongside one another in the same place. It's just wild to think about that you could have two different species of such massive herbivores living happily enough alongside one another. It was also found phylogenetically to be very closely related to the saltosaurs, which is a group of sauropods that became very successful in South America during the late part of the Cretaceous. And this is actually from just before that, so it really helps us to understand a little bit about how the saltosaurs were able to evolve, and potentially even ancestrally were even larger, with this specific animal, Bustingorrytitan, actually being estimated to be around 67 tons. So again, massive animals. Some of their relatives were a little bit smaller, some of them were similarly sized, but really important for understanding the broader diversity of titanosaurs in South America during the Cretaceous. But back to sauropod origins, we're actually looking at Plateosaurus, which is one of the most famous of the sauropodomorphs, that is, things related to sauropods that aren't yet technically sauropods. Plateosaurus is well known because it was one of the first dinosaurs found, and there was a large collection of them found in Germany. The issue is, a lot of researchers at that time went, hey, I have a new sauropod specimen. It must be Plateosaurus, and just kind of toss it into that genus without any real care to look at the fossils in better detail. And that's what this paper did. It essentially just went back through a lot of those specimens and went, hey, is there other stuff here? And they found out, yes, there is. The genera Graciosaurus and Pachysaurus were found to be valid, and essentially just more robust sauropodomorphs than Plateosauruses. I also just want to put up this stratigraphic column where it shows you the rocks they're finding these different fossils in, where you can see there's a whole lot of different layers here, but also there's a lot of different sauropodomorphs here. So hopefully we'll be able to go through that and really understand the evolution of sauropodomorphs in Europe, again, these come from Germany, at this time in the Triassic. But dinosaurs weren't dominant throughout most of the Triassic, and arguably throughout the entire thing. And one example of that is with the Araeoscelidians, which were large predatory crocodilians that lived on land, and for a lot of instances did look pretty similar to the dinosaurs. A new study on the fossil Decuriasuchus has found that it is potentially just a young version or a young stage of the animal Psuedosuchian, which would have been the largest predator in Brazil during some parts of the middle to late Triassic. There's a number of reasons the authors suggest this. The first of which is the fact that not all of the bones in the skull are actually fused together. This is something you see in a lot of young organisms, is the skull just isn't all fused. There's a lot of cartilage in there. You can see that really well when you look at human skulls from young all the way up to adults, where you can see there's a lot more fusion in the adult skulls. This means they were potentially juvenile animals, and the fact there were a bunch of them found all at once means potentially they were gregarious, living together when they were young before eventually growing larger and becoming more territorial and just striving out on their own, totally separately from the other animals in their same genus. Now there's still going to be more research done to see if Decuriasuchus is actually just Psuedosuchian or if it is its own thing, but it is helping us to understand the Araeoscelidians and how they kind of behaved. Staying with South American crocodilian relatives, we have the Barusuchids, which were largely land-based predatory crocodilians, not directly related to the Araeoscelidians, but similar kind of lifestyle. And they lived later in the Mesozoic, and this one comes from the Cretaceous. Aphaurosuchus kaiju was found in Argentina, and it's not super complete. It's really just a few parts of the skull, but based on the phylogenetic studies that were done in this paper, it seems like it was closely related to other taxa, mostly coming from Europe, especially with things like Ogresuchus from Spain. What this potentially means is that the ancestors of this group may have actually gotten started in Europe, and again, still been able to migrate across the very small Atlantic Ocean at that time, and then started to diversify in South America, living almost all the way up until the present day, only around 15 million years ago. I know my wife's going to go, almost the present day, 15 million years ago. If it's under 66 million years ago, it's recent. Of course, many crocodilians did go to the water, and there were other groups also going to the water, including the plesiosaurs, which were long-necked marine reptiles, at least generally. Some of them, including the polycotyllids, actually had fairly short necks and were largely top predators in their environments. Unktaheela specta is a new species of one coming from the western interior seaway in North America. Many previously found polycotyllids were generally just assigned to the genus Dolyrhynchops, and that's held true for a long time. And like some of the other papers that I talked about where they went back and went, hey, is this something different? They also found two new genera that were already found and in collections. This includes one from the museum near me, the Museum of Northern Arizona. Scalamagnus tropicensis comes from Utah and is now housed at the Museum of Northern Arizona, and it was found in what became Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. The other is Martinectes bonneri coming from Wyoming. This kind of study and reanalysis of these specimens is great for letting us understand how diverse the polycotyllids would have been in the western interior seaway before the widespread evolution of the mosasaurs, which came to dominate large parts of the oceans and potentially even just push the polycotyllids to extinction. It's hard to know for sure, but there have been at least some suggestions that that kind of competition, and also just predation on the polycotyllids, could have led to their extinction because the mosasaurs were just better at being in the ocean for the time that they were in there. On the subject of mosasaurs, Megapterygius wakayamaensis is a new mosasaur coming from Japan, and unlike many others, it had very large rear fins, larger even than the front fins. but it still wasn't the largest mosasaur, only around 6 meters or about 20 feet, as opposed to the 10-meter long conservatively estimates for things like Mosasaurus. The authors suggest that these large rear fins would have allowed it to pivot its body and be more agile in the water than other mosasaurs. This also potentially means it could have been hunting further out into the ocean, where that kind of agility would have been very useful for catching fast-moving fish. Think about tuna today. They're very fast and they live mostly out in open water. If you're going to catch them, you need to be pretty agile. Based on the skull, this makes a lot of sense because it would have also had a higher degree of binocular vision than other mosasaurs, including Mosasaurus, meaning potentially it was targeting more agile prey. This also really compounds itself with a lot of fossils coming from Morocco, such as xenodens, which had very serrated teeth, potentially for just sawing off pieces of large food, as well as things like Phosphadosaurus, also had binocular vision, and Gavialamimus, which had an elongated snout for catching fairly agile prey. It kind of just begs the question, was there an entire clade that we just don't fully understand of mosasaurs that were mostly living out in the open ocean, and then we just occasionally get little glimpses into them when they occasionally came closer to shore? One of the groups that's generally considered very closely related to the mosasaurs are snakes, and snake fossils generally suck, but sometimes you can get really good ones, such as this one coming from the Eocene of Germany. Eoconstrictor barnesii is the new species, and it's a buid, meaning it's very closely related to the boas and their relatives, but not pythons, so very specifically closer to boas. This is really interesting when you think about where boas are today, because very few of them are as far north as Germany. This is because it would have been the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a time when there was a large igneous province releasing a lot of gases into the atmosphere, and at least in Germany it would have been kind of subtropical to tropical environment, which totally different from what it is today. What this potentially means, because there are other boid fossils coming from Germany, that potentially they started in Europe and then actually spread south to parts of Africa, as well as spreading across Eurasia into North America and then down into South America. The world at this time would have been fairly similar, although not all the continents were in their exact positions they are today, but it does seem likely. And this makes sense when you look at their modern day distribution. Again, mostly warm places. There's one outlier I can think of, the rubber boa, but it's extremely strange and does kind of its own weird thing in the very cold mountains of the Pacific Northwest of the United States. What this means for us is, with climate change, potentially boas could start migrating northwards again. There's already some people suspecting that things like red-tailed boas, which haven't been found in the US, could potentially be living in some parts of southern Arizona. People just haven't really gotten out there to check yet because that's a very rugged area. At the same time as these snakes were evolving in the Eocene, you also had other animals evolving, specifically in this case, the whales. And this whale is actually from only 20 million years ago, not around 50 like the snake fossil was, but it helps to show that whales were getting very large, and specifically they were getting large in the southern hemisphere. The fossil is not complete enough to even name, but it is recognizable as a whale fossil. And based on the size of the pieces they found from this jawbone, it actually seems like it would have been around 9 meters. So again, starting to get into very large whale territory. This also potentially means that Megalodon wasn't limiting the size of whales like some people have suggested, because after the extinction of Megalodon, you do start getting a lot of much larger whales. It doesn't seem like that was the limiting factor. It was probably something else in the environment. Compared with fossil finds of other whales, though, throughout both the northern and southern hemisphere, it does really help to show this pattern that whales got large in the south first, and then eventually they were able to migrate across the planet and move northward. Speaking of the oceans, only a few million years ago, there was also a find of a megalodon tooth, which doesn't sound that exciting. People find them on beaches all the time. This one wasn't found like that, though. It was found by an ROV, or remotely operated vehicle, operating way down in the depths of the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 350 kilometers away from Hawaii. So again, middle of nowhere. They actually didn't even know they were grabbing a megalodon fossil. They were just taking a sediment sample, and when they brought it up to the surface, it's like, hey, there's a tooth in here. A fairly large tooth even. The interesting part about this, though, is that when they actually went back and looked at the video from the ROV, they were able to see that, hey, yeah, you can kind of see the tooth there in this shot. It's kind of far away from the camera, so it's hard to see that it was a tooth, but once you know what you're looking for, you can see it. This is also the first really solid piece of evidence that we have that Megalodon wasn't just hanging around coasts all the time. It could go on long journeys across the ocean if it needed to. But sharks also lived as far back as the Cretaceous, and that includes in this case Ptychodus, which is generally thought of as being a very crushing shark, if that makes sense. Essentially, its teeth were mostly flattened and probably mostly used for crushing up hard shelly things, and that's been the general thought for a long time. Coprolites, though, coming from southern Poland, helped suggest it may have been slightly more complex, and that's largely because there's not other sharks in the environment that would have had the ability to crush up hard things, and there's a lot of hard things in these coprolites. However, importantly, it's not just hard shelly things like brachiopods in the coprolites. There's also some very small organisms called forams, which are basically plankton. This might mean that Ptychodus may have actually functioned in a really similar way to certain types of rays, which do oftentimes eat hard shelly things, but sometimes can filter feed, and some have actually even entirely adapted for filter feeding. Think of manta rays. They're not eating hard shelly things, they're filter feeding. And so Ptychodus may have operated kind of in between those two extremes. This is really interesting, and I just also wanted to mention real quick, we know it was a shark coprolite based on the shape of it. Shark poop comes out in a very specific way. They're weird. I don't know what to tell you. At the same time in the oceans, there would have been other groups evolving too, and that includes a billfish-like fish. And I say billfish-like because it's not actually related to modern billfish, meaning things like the swordfish or marlin. But it had a very similar elongated rostrum and was probably filling a fairly similar niche. Rhamphoichthyes is the new genus of this fish. And it's really interesting because, again, it seems like it had a very similar body plan to at least some of the early types of billfish. Now, modern billfish didn't really start to evolve until after the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, when the big rock came down and killed off the non-avian dinosaurs and a bunch of other things. That said, it does help us to better understand what was happening in the oceans during the Cretaceous, which, with this whole kind of maybe cryptic group of mosasaurs, is really nice to see. It's really helping us to understand that these oceans were very productive and had a lot of diversity in them. Insects mostly went unaffected by that extinction, the KPG extinction, big rock, you heard this all just 5 seconds ago. However, there's new fossils coming from Patagonia in southern Argentina that help to show this kind of diversity that they had before the extinction, and that's because it's a wonderful site with many different insects preserved, including things like mayflies, butterflies, and normal flies. The flies belong to the Chironomidae, or non-biting midges, as they're more commonly called. It helps to show that these kinds of flies had already diversified even before the extinction that killed off the non-avian dinosaurs and really let angiosperms take over many environments. However, all of these groups also seemingly diversified at the same time that aquatic plants, and specifically aquatic angiosperms, were really turning up their diversity. So what it seems like happened is many of these angiosperms started living in and around the water, and that let many of these groups that are oftentimes attached to the water start to diversify more. Unfortunately, the mayflies and the butterflies, including some of their caterpillars, aren't as well preserved as some of the other flies, meaning essentially it's harder to tell just how diverse they were. However, it does help to hold that, yeah, these groups were around and they were hanging around lots of angiosperms and the water. Before this extinction, though, there were other insects starting to diversify, including the mosquitoes, and it actually comes from amber in Lebanon from the earliest part of the Cretaceous. Before anyone says it, no, we're not getting DNA from it. Unfortunately, DNA really sucks at preserving in the fossil record, because what does DNA do in your body when your cells split? It splits. That's like its whole thing is falling apart. So as soon as an organism dies, DNA doesn't have a long time to actually stay preserved. It's going to break apart. Interestingly, though, in modern day mosquitoes, it's basically the females that drink the blood. This one, though, had the same adaptations for drinking blood, but was a male, meaning potentially early on in mosquito evolution, both males and females were actually feeding on blood. And then later on, either some sort of climatic event or just some other thing happened that caused the males to have changed their diet and go more after nectar, and the females, likely because of their evolution, still needed blood in order to produce the eggs. Meanwhile, the males were able to successfully pivot off of that and start feeding on different substrates. It would be great if we could get DNA from it, though, and that brings me to one of my favorite animals in the Jurassic Park franchise, specifically in Jurassic Park Operation Genesis, and that's Acrocanthosaurus, a large allosauriod coming from North America. It would have lived in the early Cretaceous, before the Western Interior Seaway actually split North America in half. And that's really interesting because it's been a long time suggested that, hey, Acrocanthosaurus totally covered the entire continent. Unfortunately, most of our fossil-bearing rocks for that age are on the western half of the US, meaning potentially you get some fossils of it out as far as Texas, but on the other side of the Mississippi, nothing. At least until now. And that's because new fossils from the Arundel Clay in Maryland actually show, hey, Acrocanthosaurus got all the way out here. It's also the smallest known specimen of Acrocanthosaurus. It was just a little baby, so really unfortunate for it. But it does show that Acrocanthosaurus was very successful and very widespread across North America. Now, it still might be a different species in the genus Acrocanthosaurus, but it's very partial. It's going to be hard to tell for sure. As for finds that we kind of expected but don't really change too much, there was also a find of an ornithopod that actually was found in Romania in the Hatzig Basin. This is interesting because this would have been a series of archipelagos that existed in Europe during the latest Cretaceous. The fossil isn't actually named in this paper though, and that's because there's already a few other ornithopods we do know from this formation, including things like Zalmoxes. The thing is, this is the first time we actually have some parts of the skull and some parts of things other than the skull in the same specimen coming from this basin, at least for the ornithopods. The authors do say that they think it is something new, but also that essentially they just need to go back and look at the Zalmoxes fossils and see if there is anything else there. We really need to revise a lot of this kind of paleontology that's been done in this region because a lot of it's so partial, people are very cautious about naming new things. And hopefully now we have enough material spread across many, many years that we can actually start to piece things together. Megalodon is a new pterosaur coming from the Jehol biota. As a toothless pterosaur, it really helps to show the diversity that would have been present in this environment. It's also the only known Chowyanopterid that actually has a preserved palate. So as people start to do more research on this, there's probably going to be a lot better understanding had of this group and also the closely related groups that lived in this high altitude environment of the Jehol biota. Tracks and fossil footprints are very important for understanding dinosaur and other groups' paleobiology. I mean, just think about it. How many footprints have you made in your lifetime? And then how many skeletons have you made in your lifetime? Just the one. So there's a lot more fossil footprints that we can find that can tell us things about how animals were actually living. This paper is essentially just a review paper that looks at a lot of those different kinds of trends and how we can tell different things about dinosaur behavior, and then condenses it all into one place and lays out some of the groundwork for future work on dinosaur footprints. So with any luck, we'll be able to understand these organisms better in even just a few years' time. Dinosaurs also might be the reason that mammals age, or at least many of them age so rapidly. Humans and even things like elephants are kind of outliers that re-evolved long lives, at least according to this hypothesis. And it really is just speculation. It's not really testing anything, at least not so far. The idea is that because dinosaurs were so dominant in the environment, any of the genes that mammals needed for longer lives were essentially lost because there's no advantage to living longer because you're probably just going to get eaten or otherwise harmed anyway. So essentially, most mammals lost those genes, and some may have re-evolved them, but that might be why we see fairly short life in most mammal groups. Even in things like deer, they only live up to maybe 10 years in the wild. That would be a very lucky deer to live that long even. So it really does seem like there's potentially this kind of bias in the historical and evolutionary record for mammals to largely have shorter lives than what you might expect. But again, people are weird because we do all kinds of things, like naming fossils after Lionel Messi. And the new fossil is actually Vulture messii, which comes from Argentina, the team he won a World Cup with in 2022. Vulture messii would have lived about 4.8 million years ago. And that's really important because that makes it the oldest known fossil of the genus Vulture, of which today there's only one representative, the Andean condor. It also helps to potentially suggest that this genus may have actually gotten its start elsewhere outside of South America and then migrated in, and as these mountains were actually starting to rise up, because that's what would have been happening around this time, the Andes would have been uplifting, it seems like that may have been where they were able to go, hey, we can live here, and eventually evolved into things like the modern day Andean condor. As for other groups, there was also a study on the shoulder range of motion in Alvarezsaurs. Alvarezsaurs are weird. They were actually shown in prehistoric planet in the form of Mononychus, which just had the one single claw and was using it to dig into bark to find grubs. This doesn't seem that impractical, but its shoulder motion is going to be important for understanding that. And actually, the same single author that's on this paper had a paper about this back in 2005, which with those methods found, oh no, its shoulder probably couldn't move almost at all. It would have been very lockstep and just held in there very tightly, not really able to move and work around the wood as easily as you might expect. And this has been one of those sticking points in this idea. Well, if it couldn't move its shoulder to really dig into different pieces of wood or termite mounds or something, why did it have just this one single claw? Using these new methods though, this same author again was able to find actually had shoulder motion that was probably pretty similar to all of the other theropods. So it wasn't really special or unique other than just having that one claw, which makes sense. Potentially it was just doing the same thing that we had just mentioned, digging and looking for grubs. It's the anteater before anteaters. And then jumping to tyrannosaurs, which would have been around at the same time as Mononychus, we actually found a whole bunch of them, specifically Albertosaurus in Canada. And this paper looked at some of those and looked at trace scavenging marks, and only large theropod that could have left those trace scavenging marks in that environment the Horseshoe Canyon Formation was Albertosaurus, meaning we now have better evidence of cannibalism in multiple species of Tyrannosaur. And this seems like it's probably going to be a trend. I mean, they're not going to just turn up a free meal. Unfortunate for all these Albertosaurus that died, but hey, at least one got a free meal out of it. And then a paper we did an entire separate video on that was actually about Albertosaurus's close cousin, Gorgosaurus, and specifically a young, maybe 5 or 6 year old Gorgosaurus that was found to have been mostly eating yearling of oviraptorans, and basically just eating their legs. This makes a lot of sense, because it wouldn't need to eat the whole skeleton because there's not going to be a lot of meat on large parts of the backbone or the neck or the tail, except for the parts of the tail that actually connect to the limbs, in which case there's a very large muscle there. So what it probably did is essentially just pulled these legs off and ate those preferentially because there's a lot of nutrition there, and it seems like, at least very early on, Gorgosaurus and probably other tyrannosaurs were specifically targeting young of other species. And then as they got older and larger, they could target different prey. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. It's been real seeing the channel get so much more support on these month in reviews. They take a lot of effort to try and condense everything down, and there's a lot to condense. Be sure to check out our Patreon so you can help support us when continuing to do this. I like to think of it as a service for the paleontology community, and being able to continue doing it, I think, is a very good thing that helps the community. You know, be sure to like and subscribe too if you don't want to join the Patreon. It still helps us. With all that said, be safe, take care. Don't go extinct.